In 1944, at a quiet hotel in the countryside of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, something seemingly mundane happened. 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered and signed a financial agreement. On the surface, it was meant to be a blueprint to rebuild a shattered post-war world. But in reality, it was a brilliantly orchestrated move by the United States to seize control of the global economy, cementing its position at the center of all transactions, every single flow of money. And here's the crazy part. To this day, that system has almost never failed. It's held strong because nearly every country on Earth, whether they're allies or sworn enemies of the US, must hold American dollars to survive in the global marketplace. So how did the US pull this off? Why did the world willingly hand over this kind of power? Let's dive into that story. Imagine yourself living in the 18th century, in some remote American colony. You wake up in a simple cabin, head out to your tobacco field, and live a quiet, ordinary life. If you stood here back then, you could never have imagined this land would, in just a few generations, rise to become a superpower that dominated the world. That is, until foreign ships began to arrive. But they weren't here to help you, they were here to rule. They slapped taxes on everything: paper, tea, glass, and countless other goods. They stopped you from trading freely, banned you from printing your own currency, and forced you to rely on the British pound, and the absolute worst part, you had no voice, no representation, nothing. This went on for decades until you simply couldn't take it anymore. In 1776, 13 coastal colonies declared their independence from the British Empire, igniting a revolution. 7 years later, the Revolutionary War ended with an American victory, giving birth to a brand new nation, the United States. But even after escaping colonial rule, the young nation faced a huge problem. How could it possibly survive and prosper in a world filled with older, richer empires? At the time, the American economy was incredibly simple, relying on raw agricultural goods like tobacco, cotton, and wood. But the US had a massive advantage that most countries didn't: vast, open land, abundant natural resources, and a domestic market that was growing bigger by the day. In 1803, the US took its first giant leap forward when the government spent $15 million to buy the Louisiana Territory from France. This single deal literally doubled the country's size overnight, setting the stage for a push westward into new, fertile lands and untapped mineral resources. In less than 70 years, the US population skyrocketed sevenfold from 4 million to over 30 million, mostly due to immigrants from Europe. They came with dreams of a new life, bringing not just their labor but also their consumer needs, fueling the economy. This transformed the American market into a living, breathing organism that was constantly producing, consuming, and expanding. However, beneath this impressive growth, a great divide was forming. Two economies were operating on two completely different sets of rules. The American North was riding a wave of industrialization, while the South was still deeply tied to a plantation economy built on enslaved labor. These two regions weren't just economically different. They represented opposing worldviews, which ultimately led to the American Civil War, the deadliest conflict in US history, claiming more than 600,000 lives. In the end, the Northern Union won, slavery was abolished, and the US entered a period of reconstruction. Suddenly, a wave of factories, steel mills, and railway companies began popping up all over the country. This new rail system stretched across the continent, linking local markets into one giant, unified market. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia became massive industrial hubs. And in less than 3 decades, the US achieved the unthinkable. It surpassed the British Empire to become the world's leading industrial power. Key industries like steel, coal, oil, and railways, once the crown jewels of Europe, were now dominated by the US. This was America's first real step toward becoming a global empire. At the time, its military was tiny, only 30,000 soldiers, a laughable force compared to the ambitious European empires. But the most important foundation for a superpower had been laid: a superior economy, a unified market, a modern industrial system, and an ambitious capitalist machine ready to expand. As the 20th century began, the US was ready for a larger role on the world stage. Still, many people saw it as just one of four major economic powers alongside Britain, Germany, and Russia, not yet the strongest. But then, the world was turned upside down. In 1914, all of Europe was plunged into the bloodbath of World War I. The US initially remained neutral, unwilling to get involved in someone else's fight. But as the war dragged on and spread, American leaders realized that the one who sits on the sidelines often benefits the most. When others are fighting, you sell them the weapons. So for years, the US became the primary supplier of arms, food, and raw materials to the Allied powers. By 1917, the US officially entered the war, bringing not just soldiers but a colossal industrial base that was capable of single-handedly changing the war's outcome. The result was that when the fighting stopped in 1918, while Europe was financially exhausted and in ruins, the US had become the world's top creditor thanks to its arms sales. Now, American banks were lending money to Britain and France to cover their war debts. The US dollar was gaining ground on the international stage, a serious threat to the British pound. If World War I gave the US its first taste of the world stage, World War II put it in the director's chair. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the US officially entered the war. In just a few short years, American factories switched from building cars to tanks and from civilian products to warships, planes, and ammunition. While Europe and Asia were burning, the US remained untouched. It was not bombed, it lost no factories, and it had no shortage of workers. Instead, it was ready for production on an unprecedented scale. By 1945, the US was producing more than half of the world's total industrial output. US exports made up 1/3 of all global exports. On top of that, the rest of the world had to borrow money from the US to keep fighting, and to borrow money, you have to repay in gold or national assets. As a result, after just 2 world wars, the US held nearly 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. It was not just the winner, it was the only nation that won, got richer, and remained completely intact. When the war ended, only 2 superpowers were left standing: the Soviet Union with its military might and the US with its overwhelming economic strength. In this new world order, no one could compete with the US. The dollar, once a weak contender against the British pound, was now the strongest, most desirable currency on the planet. Most countries owed money to the US, and the world's gold was in America's hands. Economic power had officially shifted from London to Washington. Of all the eras in modern history, few are as transformative as what became known as the American century. This was a period where the United States didn't just join the global stage, it completely redesigned it. From international finance and trade to the very institutions that govern them, like the IMF and the World Bank, America set the rules. The stage for this new world order was set in July 1944. With World War II winding down, delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered in Bretton Woods. Officially, they were there to build a new economic system for the post-war world. But in reality, the game was already over before it began. The US arrived with a winning hand and a simple, powerful proposal. Let's build a new global monetary system around the US dollar. Here's how it would work. Every other country would peg their currency to the dollar, and the dollar itself would be anchored to gold at a fixed rate of 35 an ounce, a system known as the gold standard. You might ask, why would the world agree to this? The uncomfortable truth is, they didn't have much of a choice. You're a play in ruins, buried under massive debt. The US, meanwhile, held 2/3 of the world's gold and boasted an industrial machine untouched by war. Even Great Britain, once a financial superpower, was forced to swallow its pride and accept the terms. The alternative? America would cut off the vital loans Britain needed to survive. So the deal was struck. For the next 3 decades, the dollar reigned supreme as the world's central reserve currency. But the gold standard had one critical weakness. It put a hard limit on how much money a country could print. 10 gold bars meant you could only print currency for 10 gold bars, no exceptions. So when a crisis hit or a war drained your treasury, you were trapped. And ironically, the first country to feel that squeeze was the United States itself. The immense cost of the Cold War containing the Soviet Union, fighting in Korea and Vietnam required unimaginable sums of money. The US started spending more than its gold reserves could back. Its stockpile shrank so drastically that if allies like France or West Germany had decided to cash in their dollars for gold, the US vaults would have been emptied overnight. The dollar's supremacy was on the brink of collapse. Then, in August 1971, President Richard Nixon made a historic and unilateral move. He severed the dollar's link to gold. Just like that, the Bretton Woods system was dead. The announcement sent shockwaves across the globe. Panic set in. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, what was it backed by? Why should anyone trust it? Many predicted this was the end of the dollar's dominance. But America had already spotted something even more valuable than gold: oil, the lifeblood of modern industry. Without it, tanks don't run, planes don't fly, and economies grind to a halt. If the US could make the world buy oil only in dollars, it wouldn't just save the dollar, it would lock in global economic control for decades to come. So, in 1974, the US quietly approached Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter. They struck a deal. The Saudis would sell their oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, America promised them military protection, modern weapons, and unwavering support for the royal family. This was the birth of the petrodollar. Within a few years, this model was extended to the entire OPEC cartel. By the late 1970s, nearly all internationally traded oil was priced in dollars. Think about what that meant. If you needed oil, you needed dollars. And to get dollars, you had to trade with the US, invest in it, or borrow in its currency. Even the oil-rich nations swimming in dollar profits like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the way recycled those dollars back into the US economy by buying treasury bonds. The US now had the perfect engine. It could print money, fund wars, and spend lavishly without causing runaway inflation at home. Why? Because global demand for the dollar was perpetual, and all those dollars eventually flowed right back to America. But this system came with a stark warning: challenge it, and you will pay. In October 2000, Saddam Hussein, then the leader of Iraq, made a brazen move. He announced Iraq would no longer sell its oil in dollars, it would use euros instead. To the US, this wasn't just a policy shift. It was a direct attack on the heart of its financial empire. Saddam's decision initially brought Iraq a financial windfall, but it also put a target on his back. In less than 3 years, the US invaded Iraq under the pretext of weapons of mass destruction. Saddam was captured and executed, his country plunged into chaos, and ironically Iraq's oil sales swiftly returned to the US dollar. A similar story unfolded in Libya. Its leader, Muammar Gaddafi, dreamed of a united Africa using a single gold-backed currency to break free from the dollar-dominated financial system. But as his plans gained momentum, Libya was suddenly labeled a threat. In 2011, NATO bombing campaigns supported a civil uprising that ended with Gaddafi's death and a nation in ruins. Libya's oil, too, quickly returned to being traded in dollars. Even those who haven't faced military intervention have felt the dollar's stranglehold. Look at Iran and Venezuela. Both were crippled by economic sanctions cut off from the SWIFT banking system, their assets frozen, their currencies in freefall, all for daring to even suggest moving away from the dollar. For decades, the petrodollar has been an invisible throne, and every nation was forced to bow before it. But thrones, no matter how powerful, aren't forever. The world is changing beneath our feet. The rapid rise of renewable energy, solar, wind, hydropower begs the question: what happens when oil is no longer the world's indispensable commodity? Making matters more complicated, America's oldest partner in this system, Saudi Arabia, is now forging closer ties with China, and for perhaps the first time, there's little the US can do. It can't attack an ally, and it can't easily bully a rival as powerful as China. The ground is shifting. Will the petrodollar system adapt and survive? Or will a new empire rise to take its place? Only time will tell. Enjoyed the video? Smash that like button, share it with a friend, and hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.